1 second.
All right. Welcome to the August 7th SIG Auth. Let's see. It looks like the first item on the agenda is an announcement from Paris. Are you on the call? Maybe not. I'll just read it out. The Contributor Summit will be November 17th and 18th before KubeCon Cloud Native Con. And it looks like they're looking for security and SIG Auth content. So if anyone has ideas of talks or content that you'd like to see or give, fill out the form.
I feel like I'm also not presenting. However, I have share set up.
I can see your screen.
You can see it. All right.
It is split and tiny.
All right. I will. I'm just trying to figure out. How's that?
Yeah, great.
Awesome.
I think Zoom doesn't like tiling window managers.
Or Linux.
All right, Mike, do you want to tell us about your KEP?
Yeah, I just wanted to announce that 2 retroactive KEPs were sent, one for token request and one for the external auth plugin. I think the external auth plugin one merged this morning. It was just basically, both of these are basically reformats of the proposals that exist in the community repo that were pre-kept. If they're going to give us a starting point for writing down beta to GA criteria, because both these features are already beta. So if you're interested, there'll be some activity there as we start to try to get these features to GA. I will also add links to both of them, but I don't need to do that now.
Any questions on that? If not, I'll pass it over to Charles, who's sitting right next to me.
So there's been some discussion kicking around for a while now on adding OIDC discovery support on the API server, or more generally, allowing discovery of the service account signing keys from the API server with a specific proposal to do that via supporting OIDC discovery on the API server. I took Mike's original proposal for this from a community pull request, turned it into a KEP. There's a pull request out for that. I've added some additional content to it. I have some more additional content to add to it, which has its own. I'll do that as its own pull request if I find the time and if this generally looks good. Please do take a look at that. I also implemented not quite the KEP, which I also linked to and have a pull request for, but we should probably settle on the KEP and say, like, yes, this is what we actually think we should be doing. And either I can refactor that or someone else can take it on. Please take a look at that. Please leave any comments or approvals or whatever that you have.
So do you have questions or comments on this, KEP? We can leave it as an announcement and discuss offline and maybe discuss in more detail once people have had time to take a look at it.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, Rita, it looks like you're up next. Are you on the call?
Yeah, I am. Okay. So basically, early this year, we presented the Kubernetes Secret Store CSI driver. And this is mainly to address the issue where users may have stored and managed their secrets and keys somewhere else, in a KMS probably, and they want to be able to use those resources within Kubernetes applications. And so this CSI driver allows users to basically declare what provider they're using the KMS stored, and be able to access the key store and then expose the content within the pod. So much like how Kubernetes secrets work today. So as you can see, this is currently under Deus Labs, which is where we're keeping a lot of the open source solutions. But HashiCorp engineers and us, we thought maybe it would be a good idea to move this into Kubernetes SIG. And I've started to go through the repository guidelines to move something like this. And I wanted to bring this to the group to see what are your thoughts on this.
Hey, this is Andy Minoski from HashiCorp. Just as a quick aside on this, so we have, as part of our corporate policy for something like the CSI driver, typically we would be hosting that internally, or at least hosting and managing the resources. So we're happy to contribute in that regard. And if that isn't amenable, what we're also happy to do is to fork that existing provider and then work on it internally ourselves. But we just have to be able to maintain the repo for the vault portion of it. I wanted to.
So is HashiCorp Vault the target? Are there plans to support multiple secret stores?
Yeah, so this solution is provider based. So as you can see, currently there are two providers. One is Azure Key Vault, one is HashiCorp Vault, and I believe I have Jeff Molnick on the call, who is the PM on the Vault team, and he can definitely speak to this in terms of like the future of the HashiCorp provider. But the idea is to make sure that this is added to the community so that different providers could be added and supported by the provider engineer, basically.
Yeah, so sorry, apologies. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm actually one of the product managers for Vault. And I have the pleasure of working with Jeff. One of the things here is that so on the Vault provider side, this is actually more of a corporate requirement than anything else. We need to be able to maintain at least whatever is the current state of the HashiCorp provider on a HashiCorp managed repo. So if the goal is to have sort of like a living link to what would be the current state of the Vault provider, we're happy to either fork the existing that we've been working with, or to to host it ourselves. But from a corporate standpoint, we need to be able to use that repo.
One question on that: if it were to have a plugin model, would you be happy hosting the plugin model, or do you also want the shell as well?
That's a good question. I think generally any kind of code that we contribute to, we typically, in this regard, we would typically want to be able to manage what that code contributed is. So if the plugin model or the shell model is something that we would be going down that path, then anything that involves sort of the generated code to communicate with Vault, we would probably want to go manage that, assuming that we're contributing to it. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I don't understand what you're saying in regards to the proposal to move this into Kubernetes SIG. This looks like a project that is supposed to support more than just Vault. Are you saying that this needs to have a model where the HashiCorp plugin is not linked into it for you to continue to contribute to the HashiCorp Vault provider? if
So
we
for
did.
the HashiCorp provider, yes. I mean, basically, we need to be able to manage a separate repo then. If we're going to include everything into the SIG, that would be managed by us, strictly related to the provider for HashiCorp.
Yeah, so it feels like there are kind of two motions here. One from the Microsoft side, we would like to see broad adoption of this as a tool, and I think it feels like it might make sense for SIG Auth to be a sponsor of the project. And then I think the secondary concern is governance and maintainership of the Vault portion of the experience as well. I think today they're kind of laminated together. Tomorrow, if SIG Auth is amenable to this effort, we say, okay, how can we also satisfy the HashiCorp needs?
Yeah, I think that this aligns with what SIG Auth is trying to produce. I'd have to read more about it and look deeper into it to see how it works, but I don't really have objections immediately.
And in terms of the provider stuff, I think we can perhaps follow what the Virtual Kubelet project is doing, which basically ensures that each provider will host the provider code in their own repo, but the core will be maintained by the community. And so in this case, the core would make sense to be part of Kubernetes SIGs. Does that sound like a good plan?
Hey, this is Jeff Allen. Sorry, guys, this is Jeff Allen from HashiCorp as well. Rita, I want to apologize that we didn't actually get on the same page about this before the meeting here, but yeah, that does work from our perspective. I think if we hosted just the Vault piece of this, that would align well with what we're looking for. I don't think we have any intention of hosting the core here. That wouldn't make sense at all from my perspective.
Yeah, it sounds reasonable. I don't know if we have a procedure for adopting projects. Maybe we can, Tim, do you have any comments on this?
No, I agree that this looks like a great project that kind of aligns with some of our goals. I would be interested in seeing some sort of audit of the code from someone in SIG Auth,
Right.
where we sort of give it the official SIG Auth stamp of approval, just because I suspect that people have some trust that goes along with that.
It seems like we need to do two things. We need to figure out what the criteria is for adopting a project, and then we have to use that criteria to adopt this project. I don't know if we can do that in this meeting. Maybe we can propose something on the mailing list between next SIG Auth meeting for both of those, and come back and discuss next week or something.
Yeah, we also want to make sure that there's people available to staff, if there are support issues or bugs or security issues or feature requests or things like that. What we don't want is to bring it into the SIG Auth fold as a sub-project and then it get neglected or issues not get fixed because nobody has bandwidth. So kind of knowing who is going to be involved in those aspects would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm currently following the Kubernetes repository guidelines to for how we can move this repo under Kubernetes SIG org. And so to your point, like identifying the owners, making sure it aligns with the SIG charters, and make sure that we get approval from the SIG, obviously. So in terms of, as you mentioned, audit the code, and anything that I can follow up on, are there folks on this call that I can work with just to move things forward?
Yeah, can you start just send out the proposal on the SIG Auth mailing list, and we'll figure out owners from there.
And Rita, I'd be happy to work with you on getting the vault piece broken out into a HashiCorp sponsored repo.
Okay, great. I'll follow up with you guys then.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Georgie, are you on the call?
Yep. Hopefully you can hear me this time.
Yes.
Yep.
Take away.
Oh, cool. This is a good change. Okay, so probably if you remember a couple of weeks ago, we had an API review for the audit policies with regards to audit things and audit classes. So when we got together on this meeting, it turned out that we kind of lack a little bit of context, and instead of trying to guess what would be the best way to select this or that and which would be the most useful approach there, we tried to reach out to the community. So we've packed up this document that you currently should see on the screen with a couple of use cases there as a starter. Just recently, meaning today, I added also some sample policies and rules and so on, just to illustrate how this or that would be achieved. And if you scroll to the bottom of the document, I also made the effort to try to translate the example that you can currently find in the auditing documentation with the new API, just as a showcase what it would look like if you wanted to achieve the same with the proposed new API. So the point here was to get some feedback on the way things shape up, or if they're useful. How do you guys see this related to a particular role, making use of dynamic audit things? And ultimately, does it make sense, or we should make some changes there and just get on with it and finish it? So far we don't have too many comments. Actually, it's mainly from Tim and me. So I'd like to encourage everybody that feels interested into this to step up and just shoot some opinion. Not sure you can tell if this is around to discuss something, or we should leave it offline for comments in the document. What do you think?
Is this linked? Is the KEP linked from here?
Say again?
Or is the KEP linked from somewhere?
Not inside this document.
Okay.
If you jump, there is a link to the pull request, and I think from the pull request you can jump to the KEP.
Link to the pull request in this document?
Here in making is a link. If you scroll a little bit down.
Making.
Yes, making. See the word making. Yeah.
Okay. What were the? Can you maybe summarize the main changes to the Audit API that you're considering?
If you want to compare this to the old version 1 API, there are quite some changes. I mean, first of all, currently we reverse the way that, for example, stages are specified. Previously, you specify stages that need to be omitted. Currently, we specify stages that you won't include it. There is also a general change of how policies look like, meaning currently you have an audit sync resource that contains a policy, which is nothing but a set of references to audit class resources. So audit class resources are independent from the policies, and you compose a policy out of them. So the rules that you remember from the old policy are actually in the audit classes. While the levels and stages for these rules are currently in the auditing policy, meaning you control the verbosity on a different place than the place where you specify the rules. So this is probably the biggest changes that are available. And apart from that, in the way, for example, resources are selected, I don't think there are significant changes. It's almost the same. Only one probably name has changed from resource names to object names, but basically I think it's almost the same thing. And that was part of the whole discussion. Should we stick to the legacy way of selecting resources, for example, or we should, for example, include some convenience members like resources or users or user groups that you don't want, or the other way around, that you particularly want, and things like this. Alternatively, we could go, for example, wildcards, negations, and that kind of stuff, but it's all kind of, you can achieve the same thing in different ways. The problem is how to figure out which would be the best for a person in a certain role. So this is why we reach out to hear also your opinion on how would be the most convenient way for you.
So this audit policy API change, this is not reflected in the KEP yet that is linked here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Or is it already copied over?
I don't think this particularly is reflected in the KEP. I'm not sure.
I think this change was originally sort of wrapped up in the dynamic audit policy, the dynamic auditing KEP. And I do think it makes sense to kind of break this out into, it's sort of a separate feature and needs separate discussion. So a next step might be to grab the use cases and the proposal and convert that into the KEP format and submit that as a PR. I'll also take the time to read through what you've added here and leave some comments on this doc.
Yep, thanks.
What is the current API status of audit policy?
I believe it's still alpha. The audit policy. So the audit policy API in its current form it's not really a Kubernetes API. You define the audit policy in a static file. I think
it doesn't have its own API type.
I think
it's an API. It's not a REST API.
Yeah.
So the file that you load from disk is a V1 API.
Yeah.
In that case, we might need to consider compatibility or figuring out how to extend a V1 API to match this if we decide that this is preferable.
I mean, it's a different API group, and so I think to the degree that we are doing similar things and there aren't problems with the current expression, I think we should try to make them look the same to avoid confusion, but these are distinct APIs, so we don't have compatibility issues between them.
So
I think the example of like omit stages versus request stages is a good example. Like as a REST API, omit stages is problematic because it means we can never add another audit stage, basically.
So then I'm misunderstanding. Is this proposal for dynamic audit or is it for audit in
Yes.
general? Okay.
Dynamic.
All right. That's V1 alpha.
We may want to reconcile them eventually so that we don't have to maintain two separate audit policies in different APIs. But as kind of like an initial push, it's targeting a slightly different use case, which is just dynamic audit.
Okay. What is the implementation status of dynamic audit policy?
It is alpha, and the current API types simply direct the policy that is specified via the command line flag, they let you register new dynamic syncs that will receive the audit event for that policy.
Okay.
Do we consider like the audit?
Sorry, you cut out.
We lost the audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we consider the audit policy config being not in the API and being an API server flag to be part of a security boundary or not?
Yeah, so that's part of the reason that we still maintain the static configuration separately from the dynamic configuration. We don't have any plans to deprecate the static configuration and replace it with dynamic currently. And so the idea is that even if someone does take control of the cluster and have access to the API server, they can't override that static configuration.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
so maybe just for my understanding, so this dynamic audit would be additional level of detail on top of that static config?
No, so with with the static config, you also have a static audit sync that you have configured, and so it's sort of like you're always sending audit events there according to the static policy. The dynamic auditing lets you register additional audit syncs as webhooks and sort of do that dynamically. And the dynamic audit policy is defining the policy for which audit events are sent to those different syncs. And one of the goals of the API design is to make it so that you can both reuse some of the policy so that you don't have to like completely write it over from scratch for each sync that you add, but you can still also customize the syncs to be different if you have specific use cases around that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. But it's still only, I guess, as useful as your trust of the cluster, because if you're going off that sync instead of the API server static config, then you could be dropping messages if someone, accessed the cluster in a malicious way.
Yeah.
Okay.
We may have put in a provision that making changes to the webhooks are always audited and not governed by the audit policy. I think there's something in there about that. But yeah, the recommendation is still that the static, if your threat model is an attacker messing with the audit policy to hide things, then the static one offers more guarantees.
So this is just more informative than like forensic.
Mm-hmm.
I think it depends on also your authorization model for your cluster as well.
Yeah.
This could be substantially useful if nobody had cluster admin on your cluster, or just a small set of operators had cluster admin, and most people were namespace administrators. In that situation, it could be reasonably useful and reasonably used for forensics.
Purely functionally, it's actually incredibly useful when you have the situation where, for example, your API server is managed by a third party and you own the cluster, but somebody else manages the API server, and they have the static audit policy configured for their purposes, but you want to also have audit logging somehow. And because you don't have access, for example, to their syncs where they sync the events, you need to have some way to also stream events to your own location, wherever you choose it to be. So this is where this comes extremely handy.
So Tim, would you recommend modifying this existing KEP or creating a new KEP?
I think that the audit policy changes don't need to block the advancement of the current dynamic audit proposal. So I think we can bring dynamic auditing to beta with the current policy handling. And so because we would treat the new policy as sort of a separate feature, I think it deserves a independent KEP as well. So that would be my recommendation.
Sounds good. Georgie, do you have any questions, or is that a pretty good idea on how to proceed with the audit policy API design?
Actually, this was the showstopper so far. At least previously we agreed that having this this feature included is actually required for the beta. So I'm a little bit confused now. Is that okay or not?
I'm also a little bit confused as well. Tim, do you see a path to adding this after beta in an API compatible way?
Yeah, maybe it's been a while since I looked over the original audit KEP, so it's possible that I'm missing some state there, but I will take it as an action item to look over that after this meeting. And Georgie, I can follow up with you.
Sure, I'm also like fine.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Georgie.
All right, any other questions on the audit policy, or should we move on? All right, so the next item on the agenda, this should maybe have been an announcement. Whoever's typing, it's really loud. I think that's
sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is a proposal that I just sent out for a working group around refining the security response and vulnerability response processes. Take a look over it if you're interested in these things. I put it on the meeting today because I'm proposing SIG Auth as the working group sponsor. Also because I know a lot of people in this group are interested in these things, and a few of you have reached out to me about ways to get involved, and so this is it. So yeah, take a look at this, and if you're interested, kind of feel free to chime in or keep an eye out for when the group forms. Any questions about that or concerns over SIG Auth sponsoring this?
Sounds reasonable.
My question is whether a working group is kind of overkill, or if we could just handle it like discussions on changes to the existing process and PRs and email and that kind of stuff. Sort of a working group feels pretty heavy to me.
Yeah, it's a good question, and something I was kind of thinking about when I wrote this up. So I guess there's two pieces of my response to that. One is working groups are supposed to be temporary, and if we find that actually there isn't that much work to do here and we finish it off pretty quickly, then we say, okay, working group served its purpose. Let's move on and close that out. There's no requirement that working groups have regular meetings. So again, if we don't need those or we don't need them to be as frequently as bi-weekly, we can opt out of that process. Part of the motivation for this is that there isn't a great forum to discuss a lot of these issues right now. We have the issues on the new security repo. I don't know how many people are tracking that and following those issues. There's also the Security Discuss mailing list, which has would be a good place to talk about these. But in terms of like when we actually want to do something like go over a review a postmortem or discuss some issues in a face-to-face meeting, SIG Auth isn't really the right place to do that. And so part of the goal was to kind of provide a forum where we could get together and talk about those things. But yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, just having created and shut down a working group before, there is like process overhead in doing that. And I don't know, it still feels to me like some email discussions, PR discussions, and then some discussion in SIG Auth. Like, even though that's not technically the charter, I don't know, it's the same crowd to some extent. So yeah, I don't know. The process cost of working group doesn't really seem worth it to me. But I definitely agree we need to do work here. So if, I don't know, people prefer that, then okay.
I guess, so there's been a bunch of discussions around forming a SIG security in the past, and one of the kind of issues with that is that, well, it would just be the same people that are in SIG Auth. I think if we're going to start discussing things like vulnerability response processes and product security committee issues in SIG Auth, that we should probably just own up to it and say that this is the security SIG. But that's maybe a larger discussion.
I've kind of technically been in favor of that the whole time, but I guess other people disagree. So, yeah.
Greg, can you respond with that feedback about whether working group is too heavy on this?
Yeah, I'll put it in the doc. Yep.
Yeah, or in the Kubernetes dev thread.
Okay.
Just to get more visibility for people in the SIG meeting.
Cool.
Any other thoughts on this? All right. In that case, I think we should move on to or any other last minute announcements or discussions, or should we move on to triage? All right, triage it is. Everyone's favorite part of the meeting.
All right. Unprioritized, unassigned. Whoa. Allow setting ownership on mounted secrets. I really want this feature. Jordan and I talked about this for the transition balance service account tokens to transition service account, the legacy service account tokens to the balance service account tokens. It's going to be difficult to do that compatibly without either relaxing file permission or implementing something like this.
Is this not covered by FS group?
It
is issues with FS group, but
it is possible to work around this with FS group. But so we're in a situation where I think that our goal should be to isolate pods from each other. FS group gives us somebody the ability to do that. Picking the right FS group for a random pod is somewhat difficult. We could assign like UIDs to or GIDs to service accounts, or just like pick a random one or pick the nobody group. I don't think that either of those are necessarily obvious things to do. I don't know, Jordan, do you have any comments on this?
At the very least, we should add SIG storage. Yeah, part of it is what is possible via the API, and the other part is what is default via the API. For secrets, at least, the current behavior probably can't be changed by default. So the thing that we found difficult was non-homogeneous UID group IDs between multiple containers in a pod. So even if you got the ability to set ownership, unless that's done per mount, the non-homogeneous container aspect doesn't really play nice, especially when you start getting like injected sidecars where the container author is not always, there's not always a single author for all the containers in the pod. Yeah, so, and if we do it at the volume mount level, then that requires a really significant rework to the way volumes are created and mounted in.
What could we do that would be acceptably compatible with what we do today? If there's one container and it is running as non-root, is it okay for us to make the secret the owner of the secret the same as the UID of the single container?
Run as non-root doesn't give us the information we need in the API to know what the owner should be, right?
Kubelet could figure it out.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah. I guess run as non-root means that the kubelet has to know the UID. That starts to become a really weird API. Like when you look at the API and you say, I wanted it to be this owner. But see, at that point, you're talking about the kubelet just doing things magically to make things readable to the containers. That isn't even giving like a default owner knob in the API. I think for compatibility, as long as the processes the kubelet starts can read the secrets, that is probably sufficient.
So you're not worried about people who mount it in a secret and are relying on it being not readable by their container?
Is that impossible today? I don't think that's even possible today.
It is possible with projected token volumes. So
yeah, I'm not concerned about that.
All right.
I'll try to add some of those thoughts to this. And we can
I think this is a pretty complex issue that needs to be worked through.
Do we have anyone interested in following up at least on this, Mike?
I'll assign it to Liggett to drop his thoughts on it, and then he can decide himself.
Sounds good.
This is my issue. I want to export more metrics from the API server around what authentication is doing. I think this is a pretty, these are some high-level metrics around latency and success and failure. And then potentially we can start to think of authenticator-specific metrics.
Do we, are metrics exposed by any of the default RBAC bindings other than cluster admin?
What do you mean by that?
Like
how many are being used in authorization?
No, I mean like discovery or any of those default roles, public info viewer. Do any of those include metrics?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
In that case, I think it's worth thinking about whether an attacker could leverage any of this information, but probably not super high priority since there's.
I mean, there's no other way to export metrics, and you need to know what's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but I think that there's probably other things that we own that could be that we could improve observability on, authentication. But I urge anyone who's interested to pick another subproject or area and make monitoring better there. So I give this long term. And if anybody's interested in adding some metrics, feel free. Building 113 requires bigger keys. Did they turn on TLS 1.3 by default?
That seems to be what this is saying.
The key size, the minimum key size is now 1024 bits, which is already laughably small. Like that was reasonable to crack like 20 years ago.
This is a test failure, so.
So we had test fixtures that had 512 byte keys. So this is updating those. I think a release note, an action required release note that says, if you are using keys smaller than 1024 bytes, you need to increase them, and also you need to burn your cluster to the ground because it's compromised.
Looks like this is under review. Doesn't have a release note yet.
Looks like you signed the issue to Eclipse though.
Not a member of the board.
Oh. It showed up there. I want to create a bot account in the Kubernetes org that is just like not an org member so that you can assign issues to not an org member.
Go for it. Bind pre-existing role to specific resource. Specific instance without the need to make a copy of the cluster role. Did anybody get a chance to read this issue? Basically, we have cluster role bindings. We have namespace, just regular role bindings. And I think that Eric is asking for object role bindings.
Or a new attribute on role bindings that lets you scope them to a particular resource name.
But okay, so that's on the role. Okay, we don't have that on the role binding.
Right.
Jordan, I think I've mentioned this to you, whined about this to you before. I think what Eric's proposing is more closely looks like what Google IAM does.
Yeah.
Like you can set a role. The role is just a bucket of permissions. It never has any knowledge about actual instantiation of resources. And then the binding itself can be on the object as well as the container of objects.
But even a resource name on a binding is not a
It's still not the
on
same
the
thing,
object.
right? It kind of gets into a lot of stuff we in Kubernetes try to do by name, and just eventually things will reconcile to the way you want them.
But we don't do role bindings by name because they exist in a namespace. So if you delete the namespace and recreate the namespace, all role bindings are.
I think we also require the role to exist. Is that right?
Not
so.
if you have sufficient permissions. We only do that if you are not a super user, so that we can make sure you're not escalating. The thing that gets weird about the name, so like there are some things that create permissions where if you specify a name, the create permission will not be effective because we don't have name available for authorization. And so like if you bind a role and add a further name constraint, I mean, it fails safe, I guess. Like if there are create permissions in that role and you add a resource name at the binding, well, you just lost all the create permissions. So like the worst case is you end up with fewer permissions than you expected. But by separating the resource name from the resource, I guess it means that if a role allowed you to do things with lots of different resource types, then this binding would further constrain those to a particular name. I don't know, it just separating one attribute out and then having that intersect with all the various resources and verbs expressed in the role seems strange to me. Like,
I agree.
Looking at the role binding, I don't really know what it lets me do.
Yeah, I think the logical way to do this is almost to have a policy attachment on every type of object, where it's actually in the object somehow, as opposed to being a policy object living alongside an object that sort of refers to an object, but maybe not the object you thought.
Yeah, I think this is.
I don't know how to do this in Kubernetes land.
It almost seems like inline inline role.
It's like an inline rule, yeah.
What's wanted?
What do you mean by an inline rule?
I think the tedious part is you have to, so for the example of I create a resource, I create a service account that only manages that resource. Now I have to create a role and a role binding to do those things, as opposed to just being able to create a role binding that scopes it to that resource. But if you had the ability to inline the role in the role binding, then it would just cut down on the number of different objects you need to manage.
It still makes those objects more verbose than necessary. Like I might have a pod admin role that lets me do all the interesting stuff on a pod, like exec into it and update it and stuff. And now I would just have to inline that in all of my, 100 role bindings.
If you're dealing with one resource, there's only so many verbs that you really need to worry about.
Yeah, I think I agree that this would be good if we could do it. I wonder how much we get out of the work that would be required.
One argument for being able to inline roles is that roles don't have any information about the subject. So if you're creating a role that's very specific to one subject, then you kind of need to just encode that into the role's name. Otherwise, it can end up orphaned pretty easily.
I think we have a weird split between the verb and the object of an RBAC policy. And I don't see how, we can certainly talk about inlining, but to fully correct this, I think it's going to be a pretty major change to how RBAC policy is described today. Seems like a V2 type of thing. maybe inline could be achieved before that. All right, well, I put it on backlog.
Yeah, it definitely would have to be a separate version. Like
Yeah.
adding an attenuating field to the V1 API would be really dangerous if that got dropped when talking to older servers. Like if you thought you were binding a role in a limited way and you weren't. So this would have to be a new version.
Okay.
All right, well, it looks like we're out of time. So thanks everyone for joining. See you in 2 weeks.
See you next week.